Why is Smothering Tithe so awesome, and what does it mean for white decks? Find out next on Commander Replay. Smothering Tithe is a sweet new card out of Ravnica Allegiance, and I've had the chance to play with it over the past couple weeks, and it's been really good. Before we get into why and what that means, let's take a look at what the card actually does. So Smothering Tithe is an enchantment. It's 3 and a white to cast, and it says, whenever an opponent draws a card, that player may pay 2. If the player doesn't, you create a colorless treasure artifact token with sacrifice this artifact at 1 mana of any color. This is really sweet. This is an awesome piece of mana ramp that white has been missing for a long time, and after playing with it for the past week or two, one thing I've noticed is that it's a really white card that says, I may not be able to draw cards, but I can punish you for drawing cards, and it's been really sweet. So the first thing that makes Smothering Tithe really awesome is because it's good against opponents' card draw. Stop me if you've seen these cards before. We got some pretty standard green-based card draw, we got some pretty standard blue-based card draw, we got some really standard black-based card draw. Smothering Tithe is good against all of these. And obviously there's so many different ways to draw cards in Commander that I can't capture them all in this video. This is just to get you guys thinking about what you commonly see in your meta and why Smothering Tithe is probably good against at least some of those cards. But for the 3 colors that get a lot of self-card draw, blue, black, and green, Smothering Tithe is really good. One thing to note is that the best card draw spell, Necropotence, is not actually card draw, it's just placing it into your hand, so that does not count towards Smothering Tithe, just something to keep in mind. Another type of card draw that I wanted to talk about as well is more of the creature-based combo Aristocrats style card draw, things like Grim Haruspex, Harvester of Souls, Smothering Abomination, and Soul of the Harvest. That's all card draw. That stuff all counts towards Smothering Tithe. So if you have some sort of like Abzan player in your group or an Aristocrats player, Smothering Tithe is going to be really good against those things as well. Smothering Tithe is also really good because it works with symmetrical draw or group hug type of effects. So first up we have wheel effects. Wheel effects are absolutely ridiculous with Smothering Tithe. Because these wheel effects are symmetrical, they affect everyone the same. So it doesn't matter who casts these, if you have Smothering Tithe in play and there's still 3 other players hanging around, you're gonna get 21 mana and 7 new cards at the end of this. There's a pretty good chance you're gonna be able to cast every card in your hand when it comes back to your turn. And I've been having a ton of success with this in my red-white angel deck because I was already running a lot of these wheel effects to get the draw discard so I can put things into the graveyard for the reanimation spells, and Smothering Tithe has taken this deck to a whole new level. Before it was a fair deck, when Smothering Tithe comes down, it's no longer a fair deck. It can do some absolutely broken things. And while we're talking about wheel effects and card draw, there's one card that I think a lot of people forget about, especially white players and Boros players. That's Memory Jar. Again, if you're playing in those colors where it's just hard to look at additional cards, Memory Jar might be a card worth looking at. It's a little bit slow in that you pay 5 and you probably need to untap with it. In all the times that I've done that, no one's actually shot it down, because by that point in the game, there's probably something more threatening on the table that opponents want to use their artifact and enchantment removal on, so it hasn't really been an issue. But essentially you sacrifice it, put your current hand aside, you exile it, and then you draw 7 new cards. At the end of the turn, you discard those cards and get your original hand back. So if you're just needing to look at some additional cards, Memory Jar is a very reasonable option if you're playing Boros or Mono White. Again, I just wanted to throw this one out there because I think a lot of people forget about it when they talk about card draw. Another thing that's cool about this one too is that white has a Maria Shepherd as well as a few other ways to get artifacts back into play, and red has a few ways to get artifacts back into play as well, so it's not that difficult to use this thing and then have a card that brings it back and use it again. The Maria Shepherd interaction in my Angel deck has just been absolutely awesome. So again, this is a piece of card draw that I think a lot of people forget about if they're playing white or red-white, so I wanted to put that one on everyone's radar just so that they're aware of it. If someone's playing Group Hug at the table, or just randomly using one of these cards for value, so that's going to be things like our Howling Mines, our Rites of Flourishing, Temple Bell, Font of Mythos. Drop down a Smothering Tithe, and you're gonna make so much mana. And also, if you want to be the player dropping those down, again, these are symmetrical. It doesn't matter who plays them. They affect everyone the same, so you can play them and combo them with your own Smothering Tithe. Now, I wouldn't necessarily run these just for Smothering Tithe. I would have some other purpose toward the group hug aspect of the game. I generally don't like to give opponents cards unless I'm getting the better end of the deal anyway, so that just means building your deck in a certain way where you're better able to take advantage of that additional card draw and additional mana that you should be generating with Smothering Tithe. Here's 2 cards that I was really excited about when I found. These cards also happen to be really good with Smothering Tithe. I was running Gaia Reach Sanitarium in my Angel deck, and I noticed that when I paid the 3 to draw with Gaia Reach, I noticed that I get 3 mana back on that, and then I come back to my turn having looted a card, and with 3 additional mana. Really, really good. Then it didn't take me too long to figure out that Makokoro does essentially the same thing, at least in terms of what Smothering Tithe cares about. So these are 2 really easy ways to get additional value out of Smothering Tithe without even having to really use a deck slot. You're using a land slot. And because of that, if Smothering Tithe catches on the way that I think it should, I might pick up a couple of these lands now, because they may get more expensive as people start to figure this interaction out. And then, there's another really cool interaction that I'm super excited about, haven't had a chance to do it yet. And that's with Treasure Map. I've been starting to use Treasure Map a little bit anyway, just because when you're playing a Boros deck, when you're playing a white deck, you just need to look at extra cards sometimes, and the options to do that are still meh. So I've actually been experimenting with Treasure Map, and it's been reasonable. It's not amazing, it doesn't blow you away, but if you just need to look at extra cards, it is a way for you to look at extra cards that doesn't involve taking 2 entire turns off in the middle of a game with something like Mind's Eye that usually does. So anyway, with Treasure Map, you pay 1, you tap it, you scry, you put a landmark counter on it, and then if there are 3 landmark counters on it, transform it and create 3 treasure tokens. Then you can tap Treasure Cove, sacrifice a treasure, and draw a card, which is really good. If you're playing a white deck and you're struggling to find card draw, this is a nice option to look at. Unfortunately, I found out that they're a little bit more expensive in paper than I imagined they would be. I think it's seeing some standard play. I haven't really been keeping up with that, but I think that's causing the price to be a little higher than I would prefer it at the moment. So probably a better candidate once rotation rolls around. But anyway, what makes it really cool with Smothering Tithe is that when you flip the treasure map over, you only have those 3 treasure tokens. There will be times where you just need an extra mana or 2 really badly to be more explosive in the plays that you can make each turn. But then you don't really have a way to get those treasure tokens back. Smothering Tithe now gives you a way to generate additional treasure tokens, so you can repeatedly draw throughout the rest of the game if you need to. Really cool interaction. And the thing I like about it is that both of these cards are very reasonable on their own. You don't need the other one to make this work. And then there's Revel in Riches, which has a really cool treasure token payoff, which is at the beginning of your upkeep, if you have 10 or more treasures, you win the game. So if you're playing a black and white deck, like I said, Smothering Tithe is already really good on its own, so you should probably be running that anyway. There's no reason not to take 1 additional deck slot to throw in Revel in Riches and give yourself an alternate win condition. Revel in Riches, fairly similar to the way that Black Market operates, so it may just be a matter of switching out Black Market for Revel in Riches. Now, there will be some trade-offs there, but it's at least something you should think about and make an active decision on which way you want to go with that. But if you're the type of deck that's maybe a little bit short on win conditions, Revel in Riches Smothering Tithe may be a nice little addition that also gives you mana ramp in the process. And then finally, these are entire commanders that Smothering Tithe is good against. Now, I didn't go crazy with this list, I just looked at some of the more recent ones that have card draw abilities attached to them, and some of the more popular ones as dictated by EDH Rec, but of course there are going to be many more commanders that have some type of card draw ability on them. So the first one has to be Nekusar. Nekusar is the wheel deck, and like I said, if there's 3 other players at the table and someone's wheeling, you're gaining 21 mana and a fresh set of 7 cards, you're probably going to be able to play everything on your turn when it comes back. Now that assumes you don't die to Nekusar type of effects, but there's also a chance if you're running instant speed removal in the deck, that first wheel goes off, you get a bunch of mana. You can potentially kill the Underworld Dreams or whatever card they're running before they fire off multiple effects, and potentially save yourself in the process. So getting new cards and mana with mana ready to use at instant speed, very cool. So Smothering Tithe is going to be absolutely awesome against Nekusar, other than you just need to find a way to make sure you keep yourself alive, which could also be something like a Teferi's Protection. As all those triggers are resolving, you get your treasure tokens, you get the new cards. You may need to use Teferi's Protection just to survive back to your turn. Totally legit if you have to do that. And I didn't include it here, but since it's also typically a wheel deck, Smothering Tithe is also going to be really good against Yidris Maelstrom Wielder. And then we see a few more commanders, most of them recent, that have card draw abilities staple onto them. Tatiova, super annoying, but if you're playing Smothering Tithe, you might be able to keep pace on mana production with the Tatiova. Pretty sweet, right? Arcadie's got some card draw. Kami of the Crescent Moon is not one that shows up all that often, but Kami of the Crescent Moon is going to be another one of those commanders that Smothering Tithe is really good against. And then finally, Queen Marchesa at the end has a nice little card draw ability on it. You can be getting additional mana from that as well. We see a few more commanders that all have card draw abilities stapled to them. A lot of times people run Kineos and Tiro of Meletis as a group hug deck, and if they're doing that, again, Smothering Tithe is going to be really good. Baral has a loot ability. Niv Mizzet, gonna be really good against Niv Mizzet. Niv Mizzet draws tons and tons of cards. You'd actually get into a weird spot where if Niv Mizzet's doing the Curiosity combo and drawing through their deck, you're gonna be getting a treasure token for that every time. I don't necessarily know what to do with that at instant speed because you need to kill them before all those triggers resolve, but just something to think about and keep in the back of your mind if someone's going through that loop. So we talked about what cards Smothering Tithe is good against and good with, but what does all of it mean? First things first, I think that Smothering Tithe is good enough that it literally needs to go in every single white deck. I've seen my opponents doing some really weird stuff to try to deal with Smothering Tithe, which means it's scary enough to them that they feel that they need to do something with it. Now, there's a good and a bad to that, which is that if they're going to be spending removal on it every game, that may not be the best. But if you have a deck that's full of things that your opponents have to spend removal on, eventually they just run out of removal and something's gonna stick. And in all likelihood, you'll probably generate at least some mana before it gets blown up. But for purposes of your deck, what does it mean? Right now, at this current moment in time, Smothering Tithe has been out for a couple weeks. I think it just means keep doing what you're doing. Keep playing the same white cards you've been playing, and you're going to be able to play more cards per turn, do more explosive things, and basically just get ahead of your opponents with the same things that you've already been doing. You're basically creating a really nice tempo advantage for yourself. Maybe your opponents are on 5 or 6 mana, and now you're on 5 or 6 lands with 3 or 4 treasure tokens. You can do a couple things in a turn, and now opponents are going to have to react to you. So the first thing I'm thinking about is just keep doing the same stuff you're doing. It's going to be playing Enlightened Tutors, playing Stoneforge Mystic, playing Sun Titan. These are awesome white cards. You're probably using them in your white decks. But how do I think white decks will evolve as people catch on to Smothering Tithe? Well, plain and simple, I think the answer is people will start to go bigger in white. Cards like these start to look more attractive when mana isn't a concern. Ray of Dawnbringer is super sweet, but at 9 mana, it's really expensive and sometimes comes down a little bit too late to be impactful, so a lot of people don't run it. But imagine that you play a turn 4 Smothering Tithe and now you're playing a turn 5 or turn 6 Ray of Dawnbringer. That sounds pretty good, right? Even if it's just bringing back that Burnished Heart to generate more mana or that Solemn Simulacrum, yeah, that's still a really big play right there. So I think big expensive creatures start to become more attractive as you don't care about the mana cost. I was going to put Iona on here, but I know that one can be a little bit polarizing for some people, whether they think it should be banned or not banned. Turn 5 Iona is probably not fun for a lot of people, even though I did that to a Patreon the other day. Let's not talk about that. But also big spells as well, so cards like Stormherd. Now, Stormherd does suffer from one problem in that the creatures don't have haste, and your opponents are all going to get to react to it at sorcery speed, but still, if you're doing that on turn 6 or turn 7, maybe your life total is still nice and high, you're probably somewhere between 30 and 40 tokens. Also, you're a white deck, you might be gaining life. You're going to be putting a lot of tokens into play, and opponents will have to react to it. I do think that Stormherd is going to be slightly better than something like Army of the Damned, where the zombies come in tapped, because you can still block with the creatures, and these are Pegasus, they have flying, so flying is really good in Commander. So I think a card like Stormherd starts to look really attractive. And again, it depends on what your deck is focused on doing, but the idea is things that were probably just a little bit too expensive before, now aren't too expensive. You can cast them reliably, and now the question is, does it fit what your deck wants to be doing? White Sun Zenith, same sort of thing. I also think that White Sun Zenith is a card that should probably also be in every single white deck. It's really, really good. And it rewards you for making all of your land drops, and just the game going longer as you continue to make more land drops. So, if you're empty-handed late in the game and you have 10 lands out, White Sun Zenith off the top is pretty sweet. You draw it, you pass the turn, and then you play it at the end step or whenever you need blockers, and opponents don't have time to react to it at sorcery speed. And that's a really big deal. Dawn of Hope is a card that I haven't actually used all that much yet, because I haven't really been playing life gain per se. I've been playing my Angel deck, which has some life gain in it, but doesn't always come up kind of thing. One of the issues I have with Dawn of Hope, and I do think it's a really good card, but one of the issues that I have is that historically paying 4 for a token is not really where you want to be in Commander, especially in white. White has the 2 artifact doublers, but outside of that, they don't have tons and tons of ways to generate extra mana, maybe Sword of Feast and Famine. But what that typically means is that paying 4 for a small token, unless all of your opponents have absolute nothing going on, which is very rare, it means that they're probably doing something bigger than those tokens coming in. However, if you get later into a game and you're still able to make a big play and get a token, that sounds much more appealing to me. And as I'm thinking about it now, it didn't include them here, but also things like Heliod, God of the Sun, and Oketra, their activated abilities start to look a bit more attractive. Now, you can do something impactful on top of getting some of these tokens because of the additional mana from Smothering Tithe. So, something to think about, and something that I need to experiment with just a little bit more to get a feel on exactly how all of that's going to play out. But the general idea with all of these cards is that I think white is going to start to be able to go bigger than what it's been doing in recent years. Think about a card like Terastodon. Terastodon is 8 mana and is in like most green decks. And then also a card like Woodfall Primus, also 8 mana. These are expensive cards, but green decks don't blink an eye at playing them because the mana cost just simply doesn't matter. What I want you to do, think about a white deck where the mana cost doesn't really matter, or at least as much as it used to. That's the world that Smothering Tithe will create, I think. And where that leads me to is, what about cards like these? So Enlightened Tutor you're probably already running in white staple, awesome card, but what about Idyllic Tutor and Plea for Guidance? I've had an Idyllic Tutor in my box of spare cards for years now, and I'm always like, yeah, I feel like I should play it, but I never really do. Are 3 or 4 good enchantments enough of a reason to play Idyllic Tutor? I don't know. With Smothering Tithe, I think the needle starts to point more towards yes. In a few weeks of playing Smothering Tithe, games with Smothering Tithe are very different than games without it. So the question then becomes, how badly does the rest of your deck rely on having Smothering Tithe in play? And that'll probably determine how badly we want Idyllic Tutor in the deck, or Plead for Guidance, which allows us to search for 2 enchantment cards and put them into our hand. Now, Idyllic Tutor I like. Plea for Guidance is a very interesting one because it's 6 mana and gives you no immediate board impact. That's asking a lot. I won't lie to you guys. So if you're playing Enchantress, it obviously makes sense. If you're not playing Enchantress, but you really want Smothering Tithe, does it make sense? The answer is, I don't know. It's something that I'm going to have to mess with. I'm going to have to try it out. It may be one of those situational things where, like, if I have Plea for Guidance and a board wipe in hand, it's probably fine. Because you play the Plea for Guidance, you get your enchantments, and then on your next turn you wipe the board and then start laying down Smothering Tithe, things like that. So you don't just get run over by whatever your opponents were doing on 6 mana. But I don't know, it's still a little bit of a tough sell to me to tap out 6 mana for no immediate board impact. So it's just something I'm going to have to try, but this is the question that I think Smothering Tithe raises, is do we need to be playing more enchantment tutors in our deck to make sure that we have it so that we can play these really big, awesome white cards? But I'll leave this question to you guys. Do you think Smothering Tithe is good enough that we want to be playing Plead for Guidance? And finally, I was talking about this with someone in the comments the other day, and I'm really glad this came up. They asked me, is Smothering Tithe a good budget replacement for land tax? And as I started thinking about the question, the answer I came up with is yes. And here's why. So, land tax, as awesome as land tax is, another white staple, should go in every white deck. Land tax is pretty expensive in paper, so again, you get to your 8th or your 10th commander deck, you're probably not going to have land tax in all of them. And then, I also started thinking about what each card did. Land tax allows you to find lands, you put them into your hand, you play a land per turn, which is really awesome for 2 things. One, it keeps you from falling behind. It allows you to stay on the land count of whatever turn you're on, and it allows you to make your land drops late in the game. So if you get like 3 land tax triggers and it's turn 9, there's a reasonable chance that some of your opponents have run out of lands by that point, and maybe they got stuck on 5, 6, or 7 lands. Now you're on 9 lands, you're actually getting ahead of them because they're missing lands, but it takes a really long time for that to kick in. And then there's kind of the whole thing with deck thinning. I realize that it can be a thing, but what always seems to happen to me is that if I pull all the basics out, I just keep drawing my utility lands anyway, so like, did the deck thinning actually work? I don't know. But anyway, then I started thinking about Smothering Tithe and what that actually does. So, Smothering Tithe does not help you with your lands, but it does help you with mana production. The thing that I like about it is that land tax keeps you on par until all of your opponents run out of land drops. Smothering Tithe actually gets you ahead. If opponents just take their drop per turn and don't pay for it, which is the most common action, then you're going to come back to your turn and it was essentially like playing a Thran Dynamo. You're going to have 3 additional mana, and if you make your 5th land drop, you'll have 8 total mana to work with on that turn. That's really good. You can do a lot of really cool things with 8 mana, while your opponents may only be on 4 or 5 if they didn't accelerate at all. So Smothering Tithe can actually get you ahead, but it comes at the cost of Smothering Tithe is fragile, at least more fragile than putting lands into play, but Smothering Tithe can actually get you ahead in the game, which is really awesome, because I don't know that White's had a lot of cards that actually actively get you ahead, but at the cost of being more fragile than just making your land drops off of land tax. So, with all of that, I think Smothering Tithe, absolutely a very good budget replacement for land tax. Now, if budget's not a concern, just run both. So, wrapping up, why is Smothering Tithe awesome? Well, it's awesome because it gets us ahead of our opponents mana-wise. It's really good against a lot of things that our opponents are playing. It can be really good with things that we're playing, symmetrical draw effects. But also, it allows white decks to be more explosive and or go bigger in their deck building. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this look at Smothering Tithe. For me, it's been absolutely awesome. I recommend you pick up a couple copies for your white deck. And with that, that's going to bring us to the end of the video. So I'd like to take a second to thank my awesome Patreon supporters. Videos like this are possible because of them. So if you want to help support the channel and support more videos like this, or vote on which decks I play next, feel free to check out my Patreon at the link below. And as always, feel free to comment, like, or subscribe. Thank you for watching.